Welcome to Placecast, a local policy innovation partnership hub production based at the University of Birmingham. Placecast is essential listening for those keen to explore the ins and outs of knowledge mobilisation for influence in central and local government, based on the view that it's only through animating the power of place-based leadership the wicked problems of 2025 can become more manageable. Whether you're a researcher, citizen scientist, an activist, a professional working within the public sector, a civil servant, politician, analyst, or entrepreneur, we think that it is through our networks that most solutions can be assembled, tested, and the learning shared before we go again, and that universities can act as the repositories and observatories of these efforts. We're based in City-REDI and rooted in the LPIP programme funded by the ESRC, AHRC, and Innovate UK. This podcast aims to highlight knowledge and evidence-based ways of working and the strategies needed to make a real impact on the decisions that shape our society. Our guests are change makers from across the UK, with stories about the way in which influence can be achieved. We focus in particular on some of the connective tissue within and between sectors for clues as how to animate place-based leadership, as innovating is a team sport best done in the open. Please contact us with feedback on the episodes, or if you'd like to be a guest, or have strong views on the processes of advocacy, lobbying, public campaigning and more, unpacking how research and evidence connects with neighbourhood, local, city, regional and national missions. In this episode of Placecast, our LPIP innovation lead Gerardo Arriaga-Garcia interviews Nina Ruddle. Their conversation covers all aspects of place-based innovation and is a great listen. Welcome to Placecast.
Hi, Gerardo. How are you?
It's really good to see you again. I'm excited. Thanks for you're always spot on and you're so busy. So it feels like you have so many projects going on. So I really thank you for this. So welcome everybody. We're really pleased to be here today. This is a Placecast interview on inclusive innovation, and my name is Gerardo Javier Arriaga-Garcia, but people normally call me Gerard, and I guess it's because it is easier to pronounce. So I'm a research fellow at City-REDI, University of Birmingham, and I have a particular interest in making policy inclusive. Specifically, in one of my current projects, the Local Policy Innovation Partnership, I lead on the inclusive innovation agenda. And in fact, that is actually how I got to know our next speaker, Nina Ruddle. And it all happened as it normally does in academia. You cross paths with like-minded people who you are trying to collaborate and make meaningful changes. Now, let me tell you a little bit about our guest speaker, Nina Ruddle, who is, by the way, also a research fellow at the Local Policy Innovation Partnership. So she is a leader in public policy engagement and civic innovation. And as the head of public policy engagement at Wrexham University, Nina has dedicated over 2 decades to public service, focusing on education, social and economic regeneration and policy development across England and Wales. Now, Nina spearheads the university's civic mission partnership strategy, aiming to eradicate social inequality in North Wales by 2030, and her collaborative efforts have been instrumental in initiatives like the 2025 movement, a coalition of over 600 individuals and organizations committed to addressing health inequalities in the region. She's been recognized as one of the Wales Future Generation change makers. So Nina's work exemplifies really the power of inclusive innovation and systems leadership. And so, hi, Nina, it's really glad to have you here today.
It's lovely to be here. I'm looking forward to it.
As we were saying before, we actually met as part of the LPIP project. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about how you found out about it and how you started getting engaged with it.
It's quite a long story, I guess. So, but in Wales, we like storytelling. So I'm on the LPIP advisory board at the hub that's hosted by Wrexham University. And I'm also on the advisory board at the rural LPIP as well for Wales. So it's led by Professor Michael Woods in Aberystwyth with many other partners as well. And I guess how I came across it is that I was part of a workshop in Wales with the UKRI and Economic Social Research Council and Arts Humanities Research Council to talk about how actually can we create a new programme that would really connect to communities and policymakers and academia so that we can create these sort of local, I think, observatories. But I think, my big thing is it's with observatories, are we observing people in poverty? And actually that feels very sort of like ivory tower stuff. So how do we strike a bit of a balance? I was part of a big discussion group, and so was aware of this opportunity that was emerging from the Funding Council. Some of the work that I've been working across the region was used as a bit of a case study to again shape that funding call. So I was in the process of putting in a bid for an LPIP, and then our university in Wrexham, which is the university I work at, is pretty small and is not research intensive. It's a teaching and learning university, but actually we're growing that research portfolio. So capacity is often one of the challenging things for smaller players in the higher education system. So therefore got connected into the hub, and hopefully using the skills I've got in a government policy background as well as local government and across many other sectors is bringing to the fore, particularly that sort of voice of citizens into spaces where they're not normally, and actually are not there tokenistically, but are there because we should be working alongside citizens to shape the future. Otherwise we're just doing what we've done in the past, and that clearly is not working at the moment because we've got such complexity and challenges that we face. So yeah, that was a long answer. Hopefully it might have given you the pathway into the LPIPs that I've had.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting, your background, isn't it? Because we often talk about breaking the ivory tower of research, but when you look at it, sometimes it feels like it is still there.
Yeah.
However, even though Wrexham University is not a research-led university, it is growing its sort of research orientation, and you seem to be leading part of that charge. So
Yeah.
perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about how has your personal experience and background shaped your understanding of what inclusive innovation really means in practice.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think I care passionately about Wales. I'm Welsh. I grew up in Shotton, which has got massive steelworks there. So I remember the pickets and the strikes and men being out of work for months and months and months, and the impact on the community in which I lived in was really significant. And also that expectation of children and young people in that context was pretty low, and it was the 80s, so everyone would go work in the steelworks or any of the sort of industries around it, and actually the world was changing around us. I knew that there was other opportunities that I wanted to explore, and it was the power of the libraries and all the community assets around the community in which I was part of, that not many people went to university where I came from, and it was a real eye-opener for me to say, well, actually I want to be part of these debates. I want to be part of, I don't think there is a sector I want to go into in the steel industry, for example. So I was really about leveling that playing field and wanting to give young people perhaps the chances and opportunities I didn't necessarily have. I guess, you find that one teacher that sees something in you that lights your brain up in a different way and actually allows you to see that there is different expectations. And I don't think these places that I grew up in are lacking aspiration. I think it's that expectation. And we're doing now a lot of research into how we develop our work to tackle inequalities and social inequalities, particularly because we've spoken to lots of leaders and engaged with lots of children and young people and communities. And we know that if that's the one thing we tackle, then actually we'll unlock some of the other really complex social and economic challenges, like how we work towards a wellbeing economy and things like that, and how we measure that. So my background has informed what I do. I've worked at local authorities across the whole of the region, Ambition North Wales, which is the economic growth board, if you like, and also at Welsh Government leading policy and procurement, funnily enough, which I've got a real passion for, because I think procurement's a real tool that if we build procurement approaches in the right way, differently, then actually we can glean a lot of benefits for the community. So I worked on the community benefits policy in Welsh Government as well. So I'm very, very deeply rooted in Wales. And I think the reason that is, I'm a geographer background. And in Wales, we've got something called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is 10 years old. And actually, the Future Generations Commissioner, Derek Walker, last week or the week before, has just launched the 10-year report. anyone that's done geography knows that it's like sustainable development, it's like the principles of everything. And I'm really passionate about that. And having Wales being the first country to legislate for sustainable development, it provides me and the work we do at the university with a really incredible framework of enabling conversations and working together to serve our communities better, so that young kids like me that grew up in Connaskey, where I grew up, have opportunities that perhaps they wouldn't necessarily always have. And I think the Act is very much an enabling framework for us to do that. And when we talk about inclusive innovation, the Act, when it was set up, there's 7 wellbeing goals, which is effectively Wales's version of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And within the legislation, there's 52, I think, public sector organisations that have to demonstrate how they work together to towards those actions towards those 7 wellbeing goals. But I think the key that makes it really special, and the stuff that I'm really interested in, is the relationships, the trust, and the people part of it. So the ways of working, which is, in the legislation, there's something called the 5 ways of working, which is to involve, to integrate, to look long term, to prevent, and to collaborate. Now, the involve principle is for me where absolutely the inclusive innovation, because this legislation's new, it's never been there before. We're still learning in Wales about how we implement it. And, the 10-year report reflects actually that it's not achieving the systems change it's set out to do. But there's people like me and lots of other people across the region, across Wales, that are working really hard to try and understand how we include citizens and involve our communities and people we serve at all levels. So we're shifting that power balance, but then how we then mobilise to action around prevention and long term when we work within short term funding cycles as well as political cycles. So how do we shift the dial and allow any small innovation that we do to actually drive change within that whole system at those different tiers? And I call it like an ecosystem in North Wales. So I'm sort of in lots of these partnerships as well. So I can see where we can actually harbour voices of citizens. And I say that, it sounds like really strategic, doesn't it? But I mean, it's things like public narratives, like drawing out conversations. It's looking at the data and insight with citizens alongside you to analyse how we prioritise. It's, lots of different projects. But I guess I'm going down a long path already, which perhaps you'll pull me back out of a little bit, Gerardo, just to...
Not at all. That was precisely the type of things we want to discuss today. And as you were talking, a lot of ideas were sort of flashing through my mind. One of them is you're doing a great job engaging with the communities, and you were talking about being too strategic about it. But one of the associations with which City-REDI, the UOB, works, you probably know them, is Citizens UK, and they have this idea of power. And they look at organizing citizenship through power. So they do a power analysis to identify who best to collaborate. So I guess when it comes to collaborating or working through the cracks of power, you do need to be strategic about it. But it's very interesting that after 10 years, I think being the first nation who actually sets up this legally, Wales, they not being able to sort of institutionally achieve these goals, I think it's a massive learning curve nevertheless. But I think that challenge of how to mobilize short-term sort of goals around long-term goals, or short-term funding with long-term cycles, I think it communicates very clearly with that idea of place-based community, place-based innovation. So you've worked with children, as you mentioned, which I think really are key to sort of reframing innovation through inclusion, especially if we aim to achieve the SDG Sustainable Development Goals. But in your opinion, how do you think we can sort of ensure that it is not just innovating for communities, but innovating with them, particularly those who are often excluded from these conversations?
I've got a really good example to share, and it's one I share often, but I'm so passionate about it because I know it makes a difference. But it's that also, like the LPIPs and what they're trying to do, it's knowing that in your heart it's the right thing to do, but it's also having the data, the evidence, and the insight underpinning all of that. And I think for me, the way I see my role across the whole of the region is a translator between working with citizens to test and drive innovation alongside citizens. And this is where it is quite unique, that often you have people that are very senior in the role, so at the top of that ecosystem, if you like, and then you've got lots of layers and lots of different piecemeal partnerships that are created by all these different things. But then you've also got citizens, and often there's a big disconnect between what's delivered in what we call services or clients or patients or whatever we want to, but we're all part of the same community, all wanting to make it better for the people in which we serve. The way that I've worked is I'm in that very strategic space, influencing and working with, very senior leaders. But then also I'm at the coalface, or working with citizens and communities and children, young people, to understand and work with them and develop that data, insight and research that will then therefore be fed up and change the system. So that's where you can see a shift in language. It's a hard thing to describe, and it's a very difficult thing to measure, because how do you measure that there's a shift in language, the language that people are using? Like, people talk about systems leadership now across North Wales. Now, 10 years ago, they weren't. And I know it's because over the last 8 to 10 years, we've been working with partners, communities, doing open masterclasses around systems leadership. So all that stuff is part of the underpinnings of that, how we work. But I think using a really good example of listening directly to children, young people. So with the Future Generations Act, we have things, and it's similar when you're looking at LPIPs and the work that they're trying to do in local policy innovation partnerships. Is the legislation requires hugely ambitious legislation, but it's a sort of managerial infrastructure to deliver it. So it's got a public service board, which sounds like the most dullest thing possible. Well, it's not. It's great. It's a great place where partners come together. One of the requirements of the Act is that we have to develop wellbeing assessments as a public service board, which includes Public Health Wales, it includes the Health Board, it includes local authority, it includes fire and police and rescue and third sector, and then has invited partners as well. So as a collective, we have to do almost like a check-in of what's the wellbeing like of that population on that footprint. It's often the footprint of, I think there's 18 public service boards across Wales. And one of the pieces of insight we gleaned from Wrexham was that children and young people, through the City-REDI, which is the youth parliament in Wrexham, they said we want life skills outside of the classroom. The curriculum doesn't teach us how to connect in life, learn and evolve. And, the curriculum is very linear, whereas actually the way we learn is really different. And young people are asking for something different outside of the classroom. So I got some funding and we piloted something called Children's University just in Wrexham and Flintshire with 171 students and in 9 settings, Welsh and English, and a pupil referral unit. And it was about recruiting community assets. So all those groups and organisations that wrap around a school or support young people, they become a learning destination. The young people have passports to learning, and every time they do an hour, they get a contribution to 30 hours, and you graduate because you have achieved something, and you can track your skills on a skills builder platform. So it's about, really, in Wales, we've got a policy called community focused schools, and it's about sort of knocking on the door once of a school as a collective, a civic society, to go, how can we help? How can we develop content as a university that supports learning both in the curriculum, but actually just everybody's more able and talented, but how do we find their talents? And we find them in different points and parts of our lives as we evolve. So that was, for me, one of the most powerful sort of ways of listening, doing something about it, and then feeding it back. Then we were really successful. We rolled it out across the whole of North Wales. I secured some more funding, and we worked with 51 schools and 1,169 students. And we've done a research impact report on that. And we're now, with the 8 recommendations within that, we're focusing and targeting the approach on deep-rooted deprivation, because we know we can shift the dial on how we support those young people to have opportunities that would never have access to. Otherwise, the inequalities are just widening. And we know that the stats say in Wales, 29% of children, are living in poverty, and it's getting worse. So actually, we've got to really shift the dial and all work together collaboratively that enables that to stop, and so that we can put mechanisms in place to support that. So on top of the North Wales Children's University, just another great example, we did something called TED Talks. Everybody knows TED Talks. And it was about trying to engage those older young people that wouldn't want to necessarily go and do the Minecraft after school. It was trying to empower through leadership skills young people that was a bit older, because anyone that says Children's University, I think, years 8 and 9, it sort of drops off. So we did a program called TED Talks, which was around well-being, and we went in and coached young people with how to do a TED Talk and a public narrative, and how to identify your collective challenge. We then hosted, and they're not called TED Talks anymore, they're called Bob Talks, because Bob was a character that young people identified as part of their stigma and bullying. Bob is now symbolic of our listening to young people, taking their voices and taking them to the leaders to say, this is what our young people want and need, this is how we need to shift the dial. So I guess it's that constant sense making of bringing all of these different aspects and elements together, from data and insight through to voices, through to storytelling, through to as touch points, to then bring the head, the heart and the hands into that ecosystem, which sometimes just understands numbers and doesn't have the human side of stuff. And part of that, like arts and creativity as well, is a big part. So yeah, there's a lot of projects that we're doing in that space.
Those are two fantastic examples, and I think they actually come to illustrate the importance of going beyond your normal sort of boundaries of topics, and which is sometimes the problem with research, isn't it? The work, sometimes they work in silos, and I think arts have actually gained momentum, thankfully, to sort of revolutionize or at least change how we do things, so like changing the status quo. It's interesting because you sort of went ahead, because one of the questions I had was precisely on a concrete example of how things have worked, which you very clearly exemplified. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about practical steps, because you've sort of walked us through the what worked, and you described the projects and the outcomes. But in your own words, what would you say actually has worked to move these historically marginalized groups from the sidelines to the center of these policy development processes? And where do institutions still struggle to achieve that?
I think there's certainly something in language. So I see that we set up these infrastructures that almost they seem a little bit impenetrable or not connected to communities that they serve, and there's lots of reasons why, because we have to be accountable as public bodies, because it's often public money. There has to be transparency, absolutely. But I guess there's an area where we can innovate, and we've got a new vice chancellor at Wrexham who's doing a fantastic job. It's like where we fail and fail quickly, and we can move on and learn more. But I think there's something about language, that we speak different languages. There's something about infrastructure that feels really locked down. So the PSB is a really great example where I find the spaces are, connected, they're strategic, they're often very, very key leaders, but I think some of the work I'm trying to do is opening up that public service boards to have more memberships that are at every level. So I always say that if you're about change, you're a leader, regardless of where you are in that system. And then there is something about, as our vice chancellor says, it's that learning quickly, and how we fail and accept failure is a good thing to learn from it. And then also how we understand the human side of citizens. And it's not because that's the fluffy stuff, it's because that's the hard stuff, like how we shift the dial on, using different methods to prioritize what we do and where we put public money, which is finite massively at the moment. And how, my job of work is to really push boundaries with citizens to make things happen, which is what we've done in parts, and then to present that to the system so that it doesn't try and like lock down and go, oh, this is alien, we don't understand it. Actually, to allow the system, and I say the system, it's the people within it as well as the sort of governance within it. It's like how we can understand that, unpack that, and accept that, so that it changes the way we do things and the way we work and where we put our money. But pooled resourcing for me, and pooled priorities, getting that shared narrative, is absolutely pivotal. And I think it's took me, I would say, most of my career to get to the point now where we've got some really incredible regional working where we've set up a North Wales Insight partnership, which is about exactly that, innovating with citizens and communities. We've got this co-produced community narratives where 6 towns across the whole of the region, we're working with artists to go into these spaces to understand what that place means to those communities, which often the data tells you one story, but actually using the power of arts, creativity and engaging in a different way can tell you a very different narrative of how citizens see that space. So I think it's that data stuff. It's like, what is data? How do we understand data and therefore research, and how we use that to understand impact, be it good and bad, so that we share the learning. We don't repeat or continue doing the stuff that doesn't work, and we're brave enough to do the stuff that does. But it's that whole like holding together as a convener and a host of bringing players together in that system, both from at every level, to get that shared narrative. And that's the point we're at the moment in North Wales with the Future Generations Commissioner. The week before last week, I think it was, we brought together a North Wales Civic Engagement Partnership, which is 40-50 leaders across the whole of the region, from third sector, Police and Crimes Commissioner, Children's Commissioner, Future Gens Commissioner, but then lots of players and partners from Ambition North Wales, Skills Partnership, Regional Partnership, but like every partnership that is trying to work with communities, we brought them together and said, what is it that are the things that matter to the communities in which we're trying to support? And that will help us shape a shared narrative so that actually we can pull resources across the system to put them where it needs to go, rather than where all of these piecemeal partnerships need to be, because it's unnecessarily complex. And it doesn't need to be like that. We are here to make sense of those partnerships and simplify them to a point.
I think your work, as you described it, pushing boundaries, it's really powerful and meaningful. And I think the words of the vice chancellor, I think you were probably paraphrasing him, but learning and failing quickly to move on. I think that's really powerful, because we often learn the most from what actually didn't work. So I was wondering if there was something you could share, like an initiative aimed at inclusion that you thought actually fell short, and what you took away from that experience?
That's a big question. I always say that if you don't win, you learn. So I always see everything, as painful things can be. I think probably the biggest frustration I've got is that just I often feel sometimes like a few steps ahead, because I'm with communities and I'm with children and young people, doing some sessions with children and young people. Then I'll be in a meeting with the chief executive, and I've got the lens of both, and I hold that. And I guess the frustration is that I feel sometimes like you bang your head against a brick wall, because you have to take people with you on that, and you have to say things like 15 times in order for that to be accepted. And, creating fear in the system of change can bring real challenges. So I guess the pace of change I get frustrated with, and there's some things that in certain parts of projects that have not worked as well as I could have, should have. But actually what I do is we learn and go, well, how do we fix it? And how do we fix it quickly? And I think because I'm really lucky, we're a really small university with a lot of rooted partnerships across the region. But because of that, we can be far more agile. So I don't think I probably directly answered that question about what's gone wrong. But I think the stamina is the hardest part, I think, it's just keep going and having that stamina, like get the energy from the people that are on that same journey as you, because sometimes it can feel quite lonely, which I guess for lots of leaders, it feels quite lonely. And what we do is try and bring spaces together that are safe for leaders to just support each other and share, because it's really tough stuff that we're all dealing with, and we're all trying to work to the very best of our capacity. But yeah, I don't know whether that answers that question. It probably does.
I don't think there is a direct answer to such a difficult question, but I think is that learning, isn't it, of the process. And I think you've been answering that question throughout your conversation today. And one of the key things that we could do after this, for instance, is looking at the Future Generations Act and the report, and then extracting from that some of the lessons learned, and sort of curating perhaps a blog, and then some sort of steps of what were the reflections, and what can we say about that, because it's a whole country, isn't it? And what are the lessons that can we learn, because I think that would be important for the LPIPs as well. But maybe that's something we could talk at another point, writing a blog about it, maybe a report or something. But it does seem that Future Generations has sort of, in a way, helped to shift the narrative and to some extent these power structures, and so it looks as if the whole of Wrexham and probably the whole country are more prone to thinking or openly discussing community driven action, policy, and innovation. But can you think of any example where this has sort of led to the first steps, if you want, of a systemic change?
Yeah, I think one of the big examples I could probably share is around climate change. And it often feels like, oh, well, we'll leave that there over there for somebody else or some other policy. And actually, it's everybody's business, isn't it? We all need to be actively contributing and mitigating the impact of climate change. And one of the pieces of work we did through, again, the North Wales Insight Partnership is I set it up with lots, and it was a true collaboration of all the public service boards across North Wales. So there's 3 of them, which is 6 local authorities. So it's a population of about 700,000. One of the things that we did quite quickly, and we commissioned it as part of our civic mission work, very, very small piece of work, was looking at how we worked with citizens to analyse climate change and data around climate change. And we worked with Natural Resources Wales, and we worked with a brilliant academic called Dr. Anne Collis. And we worked to develop data packs, and we recruited 12 citizens across the whole of the region, which was like a microcosm of society. So it was a homeschooler, an 18-year-old, an 80-year-old, a climate change denier, a refugee, asylum. So we tried to, really, and that sounds tokenistic in itself, but we tried to get a broad group that would be a representative of society. And then we brought them together with these data packs, and we enabled, and it was just we were just coming out of COVID, so we were still sort of in lockdown, and that information, we looked at things like flooding. There was certain data packs, 3 themes, 3 workshops. And what we also did, which I think is really, really important when we go to talking about how we work with citizens in public services, or we often ask citizens to contribute lots and lots and lots. We get paid, and those citizens are the experts in some of the stuff that we're asking from them, but we don't value that because sometimes we don't even go back. But so what we did is we paid those citizens for their time as well. So it was part of us valuing their expertise. There was a report that was produced at the end of that, but the biggest impact, I would say, is that all of the partnership ecosystem that is enabled, that I'm sort of part of, that piece of work, I think, influenced where we're at now, which is we're in discussions as a region to work on a climate change risk assessment for the whole region that allows us to look at working together once on a climate change risk assessment that allows us then, so instead of lots of organisations doing it individually, we do it once for the region, but then we take it back into organisations and partnerships and then make it our own. But it's not one version of the truth, but the climate change challenge that we've got across the region is going to be similar. So we're going to be doing it once for the region. So I think that it's really powerful that it's changed things, but sometimes it's just a little seed of something that has been the catalyst, and it's really difficult to track that back, which I think for me, when you look at the LPIP hubs, that's the value of bringing academic data, insight, research, evidence into the forefront of that and working with citizens is a real powerful combination, because it's the power in the partnership that makes the difference, and it's the value of everyone's knowledge base in that space is as of equal value, the citizens, academics, practitioners, policymakers. And then emergent from that, we talked about deliberative democracy and how we worked with citizens in a different way, and we're still evolving and unpacking that. I know Welsh Government have recently just done a piece about deliberative democracy in Wales. So that's a sort of an example I can give that has achieved change. But yeah, it's difficult because sometimes it's just a feeling as well as an impact, and that's where, and then you have to have, the funding is you have to have the funding in place to actually have the research that's really powerful, because that is the thing that often changes the system. So it's just trying to hold all of those things together at the same time, which is what the LPIPs are doing, for me, is where the magic will happen.
That is actually fascinating. And, you know, that project you just highlighted, the one on sort of data and climate change and the recruitment of these 12 citizens. And it's interesting because it looks like you were able to mobilize assets, to mobilize resources, and sort of push
Yeah.
forward the discussion
Mm.
on risk assessment, which in itself, being a small project as you described it, I think it's really meaningful. But I think going back to your point of measuring, you know, especially the issue of participation and co-creation and inclusive innovation, it seems to be a bit of a gray area, especially for policymakers, because most of them, or a lot of them at least, are sort of interested on numbers, and they want to see graphs and percentages and measures. So, you know, the question really is, how can we measure the success of including the community, you know, beyond the traditional outcomes? You know, how do you assess what worked and what didn't, who participated,
Yeah.
and whose knowledge counted?
I think it's a really difficult balance, isn't it? Because I think it's like I've been trying to. It's the difference between like engagement and research. Now, research generates new knowledge that allows the system to change, but an engagement is where you connect and you understand communities. And sometimes it's a lot quicker and easier to do engagement work, which is a lot of the practitioners and policymakers. That's the stuff they'll do. Whereas with the research stuff, it's understanding the importance of ethics and having that underpinning stuff, and then the finances. So I think the way that we've done that, like how you measure it, is starting with conversations and starting with a collective purpose, and therefore everybody's voice is equal and around the table. And one of the things and the principles of some of the work we do around systems leadership, it's an open system. So in theory, if you've got an interest and you care about it, then come along. So on the 22nd of May, we've got a big child poverty conference, and it's if you're interested, come along. We've got a minister there, and it's about how we work differently collaboratively to tackle child poverty, where families have dignity and respect, where we do, work across the system in a more strategic way, and we mobilise towards a wellbeing economy that doesn't grow GDP without the compromise of wellbeing, and so it's that really careful balance. But I think for me, it's no voice is hard to reach. We just need to find the right way to reach them, or open access that others can reach us. So I think it's about just being far more open and not so scared. I think there's a bit of a,
Yeah.
I think particularly from an academic perspective, because everything in the research context has to have the ethics, which is right if it is research, but if it's engagement, then it's there for different reasons. So I think it's about the clarity of what you're doing and why.
All right, no, that makes sense. If you could later, or I'll send you an email reminder. Send me details about that child poverty conference. Is it online or?
It's in person. It's in person in Llandudno in North Wales. So yeah, if you could make it, be great. Yeah.
Okay, I'll have a look at it. But yeah, I'll ask you for the details. Right, so I think we are fast approaching sort of the end of this fascinating conversation. I think most of the questions I actually had, you've actually answered in advance. I wanted to talk to you about the role of Wrexham University and its civic mission, which you completely explained, the issue of power imbalances, which you have also touched upon. So I guess my last question, it's, if you could make one strategic move to permanently improve how inclusive innovation happens in a specific place, like Wales, what would you choose and why? And keep in mind that you can have no restrictions in terms of funding. You can actually present your idea to the cabinet. You can influence and advocate and basically do whatever it is that you want to do. What would be that strategic move?
I think one of the biggest things I've learned on the civic mission work with Wrexham University is that it's grown exponentially and organically, and it can be a bit messy, but that's okay. It's okay to accept that it's messy, because that's the nature of being human, isn't it? And I think I would say to have a really clear narrative, be it, that's out there and that people understand. So that if there's a clarity of purpose to what you're trying to do, and that's a clarity around the problem we're trying to tackle, not jump to solutions. If we have that, then it means that anyone that cares about that can join you in that movement for change. And I think for me, that's what I'd really want. And we're trying to work in that way where we have that regional narrative, where we have that rallying call to go, this is what we're all caring about, which then allows communities to connect into that, because there's an understanding and a common rallying call for others to join on that journey. Because unless we start doing things like that, we can't continue doing what we're doing in the way that we're doing it, because it's clearly not working in parts. And I think that for me is where telling that story and allowing people to connect into you is really, really important.
That is really powerful. And that what's interesting is that whilst you were saying all of this of embracing messiness, having clarity of narrative, having clear purpose, and clarity of the problem, all of that what you're saying, actually, I don't know if you know it, but it's really what you are doing. So to a large extent you are walking the talk, which I think is one of the biggest challenges. And it's very fascinating and, for me personally, interesting to see people like you who are trying to sort of bridge the gap between research and practice, and more importantly, doing meaningful stuff, not for people but with the communities. And so it's again, it's fascinating to see everything you've been doing. But we're coming to an end, Nina. I don't know if there is anything else you want to say to wrap it up and conclude this podcast.
I would just say that you're right there, that it's the implementation gap. So I think in Wales and a lot in the UK, there are, particularly in Wales in the context, there's some great policies. I think the biggest challenge is the implementation of those policies, and that's because we need to involve citizens, and it's the way of working. So we just need to be really minded of everything starts with trust and relationships, and that goes with the communities, young people, children, but also leaders as well. So I think it's about levelling that playing field a bit and bridging the implementation gap in many ways.
Thanks, Nina, and thanks for your time. Thanks all the listeners as well for tuning in. This was another episode of Placecast Interview Questions on Inclusive Innovation.